In this presentation, we will discuss student loan interest and adjustments for adjusted gross income. We're going to be here on line 2 of our income tax formula, line 1 being income, line 2 being the deductions or adjustments to income. We can compare and contrast those deductions to the itemized deductions and the standard deductions. Now, when we're considering the student loan interest, we will be looking at the Schedule 1, where we will be having all of our adjustments, a separate schedule to the 1040. We are here on line 20, where we have the student loan interest, which would be included here, summed up for all of the adjustments to income, which would then pull over to the page 1 of the 1040 on line 8A. Now, when you're considering student loan interest and entering that data into the tax software, it should be fairly straightforward because you will receive documentation for it. And therefore, if it's properly filled out and we have the proper documentation, it should be a straightforward process for the data input process. Who would have student loans? Obviously, it would be someone that went to school. They took out loans to go to school. You would be expecting it someone possibly that is finished school at that point in time and is now paying back the student loans with the interest on it. The interest portion of those payments then would be the amount that could potentially be resulting in a deductible portion here. And in order to do that, we should generally get from the institution of the loan the amount that would be the student loan interest that would be possibly deductible, making it a fairly straightforward data input process. So let's get into more detail about the student loan. Student loan interest must be a qualified student loan, so it's got to be a qualified student loan incurred by the taxpayer to pay qualified education expenses incurred on behalf of the taxpayer, taxpayer's spouse, or any dependent of the taxpayer at the time the loan was incurred. It can be deduction with a cap up to $2,500. So up to $2,500. Above that, no deduction. Notice that this information would be useful if someone was to ask questions about the student loans and taking out student loans, because at the time of the tax preparation, we may already have the interest form and we could just data input that into the system. But if someone has questions about student loans and the deductibility of the interest portion on the student loans, then you can get into detail on that. Qualified education expenses, cost of attendance at an eligible educational institution. It would include things like tuition, of course, the fees, books, supplies, equipment, room and board, transportation, other necessary expenses. Qualified education expenses must be paid or incurred within a reasonable time period before or after the loan date. The course of study can be either undergraduate or graduate. So we could be talking about undergraduate or graduate. Student loan interest limitations, modified adjusted gross income. So we have this adjusted gross income, modified adjusted gross income again. And remember, when we look at our equation, the modified adjusted gross income is going to be, the adjusted gross income is going to be here. We have our gross income minus the deductions to give us our adjusted gross income. When we think about phase outs as income increases and basically the deductions go down over time, it's often going to be based on some format of the adjusted gross income. If there's a modification to it, as in this case, it's going to be the modified adjusted gross income. That means just basically this line with modifications specifically related to this deduction. So if we go back over here, what is the modified adjusted gross income? We're going to start with the adjusted gross income. We're going to add any deduction for student loan interest. So obviously, if you think about this, the student loan interest would go here. So we're going to add back basically the deduction for the student loan interest. We're not going to include that in essence in our phase out basically calculation to see how much would qualify for student loan deduction. So AGI plus any deduction for student loan interest, foreign U.S. Possession, or Puerto Rican income exclusion from taxable income, deductions taken for tuition and fees, deductions taken with regard to domestic activities production, and that's going to be our calculation of the modified adjusted gross income. Student loan interest limitations. Student loan interest is reduced when modified AGI gets to, so we're going to take that modified AGI and reduce the amount when it gets up to married filing joint, $140,000, or single, $70,000. Student loan interest is eliminated when modified adjusted gross income gets to 180,000 to for married filing joint to single 85,000. Therefore, if you imagine that we got our form that's going to report the student loan interest, we're putting this into the tax return. We are expecting it to have an adjustment here on our tax equation, reducing the adjusted gross income. That amount will be phased out depending on how high the income is, the amount of the deduction. Married filing joint, if it's going above the for 140,000, it'll start to phase out until it gets to the 180,000, in which case it'll be gone altogether. For single, it's going to start to phase out at the 70,000, and then as you get up to the 85,000, once you get past 85,000, you will no longer get a benefit from the student loan interest. The form for the student loan interest will look something like this. Student loan interest, it'll say 1098E. So remember, this isn't a 1099. Whenever you see a 1099, you're going to think, oh, that's something that I might have to include in the income line, right? That might be up here. If you see a 1098, then you're thinking that this might be some other tax-related line item, in this case, a possible adjustment for income, the above-the-line deduction or Schedule 1 deduction. Now, it may not look exactly like this in terms of shape and format, because it might be coming from the institution of the loan, so they might have a different shape to it, but the fill out and the information on it will be much the same. And if you want to go and check this information in terms of if you have questions on any of the boxes within it, usually on the back of the form you'll have instructions to it, or you can go to the irs.gov website and look up the instructions for 1098E form.